My father didn't even wait for the tea to cool before he pushed the legal-size envelope across the scratched mahogany table. "You always had your mother's soft spine, Marlo," he said, his voice flat, completely devoid of the tremor you'd expect from a man whose wife of 40 years had been buried just 3 days prior. "But a soft spine doesn't inherit a logistics firm. Your brother is taking the keys to the estate. You get the Honda, the contents of the hallway closet, and exactly 0% of the capital. It's what you deserve for checking out of this family the second things got difficult." I looked at the silver monogrammed cufflink peeking out from his dark suit sleeve. The same cufflinks Mom bought him for their silver anniversary, the ones he wore while sleeping with his regional manager in a boutique hotel downtown, while Mom was in her second round of chemotherapy. He thought he had scrubbed the board clean. He thought because he spent the last 18 months systematically alienating me from the board, cutting my clearance at the firm, and rewriting his own will with a team of high-priced corporate sharks, he had won. What he didn't realize was that the mahogany desk we were sitting at didn't belong to him. It belonged to the estate, an estate funded entirely by my maternal grandfather's original textile patents. "I see," I said softly. My hands were folded tightly in my lap, my thumbs pressing into my palms until the skin went white. I didn't cry. I had run out of tears somewhere around month 6 of nursing Mom through the delirium, while my brother, Vance, was busy standardizing the company's new offshore tax shelters. And Vance is completely on board with this arrangement. "Vance understands the weight of a legacy," my father replied, standing up to look out the tall bay windows of the study. The rain was streaking the glass, blurring the manicured lawn Mom used to tend with bare hands until her fingernails cracked. "He's already signing the restructuring paperwork at the main office. Don't make a scene, Marlo. It's unseemly. You're 32. It's time you built something on your own instead of leeching off my sweat." His sweat. I almost smiled, but the muscle in my cheek just twitched. My mother, Thalia, had been a quiet woman, the kind who smoothed down the edges of tablecloths and never raised her voice when the dinner sat burning because my father was detained at a conference. But she wasn't blind, and she certainly wasn't stupid. 3 weeks before her heart finally gave out, when my father and Vance were at an executive retreat in Cabo, she had called a mobile notary to her hospice bed. I reached into my canvas tote bag, past the old receipts and the bottle of lavender lotion I used to massage her swollen feet, and pulled out a single, thin document bound in blue paper. It wasn't a will. My father's team had locked down the will months ago. This was an amendment to the Thalia Vance Irrevocable Family Trust, the foundational entity that held 80% of the voting shares in the logistics firm. "You should call Vance, Dad," I said, my voice barely louder than the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. "Tell him to hold off on the restructuring. He doesn't have the authority to sign." My father didn't turn around immediately. He kept his back to me, his hands resting on the windowsill, watching the rain pool in the gravel driveway. "Don't be pathetic, Marlo," he said, his shoulder twitching with a dismissive little shrug. "Vance has had power of attorney since November. I saw to it myself. Your mother signed the corporate governance transition while she was still lucid." "She signed the corporate paperwork, yes," I said, smoothing down the blue cover of the document on the mahogany desk. The paper made a sharp, clean sound against the dark wood. "But she didn't sign over the trust. You forgot that the trust holds the actual asset deeds, Dad. The company operates on land and licenses owned by the trust, and the trust wasn't a marital asset. It was grandfather." He turned slowly. The smug, ironclad certainty on his face didn't shatter all at once. It eroded from the edges. His eyes dropped to the blue folder, then snapped back to my face. "Your mother didn't have the stomach for legal maneuvering. She didn't even like looking at the quarterly balances. She didn't like looking at them because every time she did, she saw the line items for the corporate apartment in Chicago," I replied. My voice was steady, devoid of the heat that usually signals a fight. It was just a statement of fact. "The one you stayed at during the logistics convention. The one where you brought Janine." The room went entirely silent, save for the rhythmic, dull thud of a loose gutter outside. My father's jaw tightened, a tiny muscle jumping beneath his shaved cheek. For a second, I saw the man who used to make regional managers sweat through their shirts during performance reviews. "You think you're being clever." He lowered his voice. stepping toward the desk. You think a dying woman's erratic scribbling is going to hold up against a corporate legal team that I've paid 7 figures over the last decade? It's not erratic scribbling. It's an explicit restructuring of the trustee hierarchy, I said. I opened the folder to the signature page. There it was. Her handwriting, usually so elegant and flowing, was shaky, the T in Thalia trailing off slightly where her strength had failed her. But the notary's stamp was dark, crisp, and entirely legal. Mom didn't remove Vance or you from the trust, Dad. She knew that would trigger an automatic audit and alert your lawyers before she passed. She did something much simpler. She appointed a special independent trustee with sole veto power over asset liquidation and corporate restructuring. Me. He stared at the page. He didn't reach for it. To reach for it would be to acknowledge that it had power. Vance is at the office right now trying to move the company's capital into a new holding company under your name, I continued, looking at my watch. It was 2:15 p.m. The bank requires a certified clearance from the trust manager for any transfer exceeding $50,000. I flagged the account 45 minutes ago. Right on cue, the heavy black smartphone resting on my father's blotter began to buzz. It vibrated violently against the wood, the screen lighting up with a single name. Vance. My father looked down at the buzzing phone, the glass screen reflecting the gray light from the window. He didn't pick it up. He just watched it dance across the mahogany, a 3-second delay between each vibration that felt like a physical pulse in the small room. Answer it, Dad, I said. He's probably calling from the boardroom. He hates when the bank clerks look at him like he's a child who forgot his lunch money. With a jerky, uncharacteristic movement, he snatched the phone off the desk and pressed it to his ear. He didn't look at me while he spoke. Vance, what is it? I couldn't hear my brother's exact words, but the frantic, high-pitched tin of his voice bled through the receiver. My father's expression changed from calculated annoyance to something tight and hollow. He listened for 30 seconds, his fingers gripping the phone so hard the plastic casing creaked. They said what? My father muttered, his voice dropping an octave. No, that's impossible. The paperwork was cleared by Harrison's office last month. Just stay there, don't sign anything else. Don't speak to the branch manager. He cut the call without saying goodbye and tossed the phone back onto the blotter. It slid across the leather surface, stopping just short of my blue folder. You think this is a game, he said, leaning over the desk, his hands planted flat on the wood. He smelled of expensive cologne and the faint, bitter scent of the black coffee he'd been drinking all morning. You've blocked a standard capital transfer. All you've done is stall a necessary corporate transition for 24 hours. Tomorrow morning, my legal team will file an emergency injunction on the grounds of your mother's diminished mental capacity when she signed that amendment. She was on heavy palliative care, Marlo. A judge will toss this out before lunch. She was on a localized nerve block, Dad. No narcotics, I corrected him, looking directly into his cold, gray eyes. I made sure the hospice physician documented her chart every single day. Her cognitive scores were perfect. In fact, the day she signed this, she spent 2 hours balancing the household ledger just to prove she could. I reached into my bag again, pulling out a small, black USB drive. I laid it gently next to the blue folder. And if you try to drag her medical state into a public courtroom, I continued, I'll be forced to enter this into evidence to protect her estate. It's a digital archive of the company's internal server logs from the last 3 years, the ones Vance thought he archived on the private drive. My father didn't move. He didn't even seem to breathe. What is that? He asked. It's the full paper trail of how you used company logistics lines to transport Janine's personal art inventory across state lines without paying the interstate commercial tariffs, I said softly. And the receipts for the corporate apartment, which you listed as an operational training facility. It's tax fraud, Dad. Grounded, boring, easily provable tax fraud. If you contest the trust, this becomes public record. And I don't think the board or your remaining clients will care much for a logistics firm under federal investigation. Rain outside seemed to grow louder, a steady, relentless drumming against the glass that filled the silence between us. My father didn't rage. He didn't slam his fists on the mahogany desk or call me names. That wasn't his way. Instead, He slowly pulled his hands back from the wood, straightened his spine, and buttoned his suit jacket with meticulous, robotic precision. "You've been planning this," he said, his voice dropping into a chillingly calm register. "While your mother was wasting away in that bed, while I was trying to keep the firm afloat during a supply chain crisis, you were digging through corporate servers like a thief." "I didn't have to dig very hard," I replied, keeping my hands resting quietly on my lap. Vance used the shared administrative password for his personal folders, the one Mom picked out 20 years ago. He never bothered to change it because he assumed no one else in this house knew how a database worked. He let out a short, dry breath that was supposed to be a laugh, but sounded more like a cough. "Your grandfather built that firm from a single warehouse in the shipping district. I turned it into a regional powerhouse. Every luxury you've ever had, the private school, the college tuition, the apartment downtown, was paid for by my decisions. And now you're going to choke the life out of it because your feelings are hurt." "This isn't about my feelings, Dad. It's about Mom's terms," I said. "She didn't want the firm destroyed. If she did, she would have handed these files to the IRS months ago. She wanted the business to survive, but she wanted it protected from you. The trust amendment doesn't strip your operational title. It just freezes your ability to bleed the company dry for your retirement in Florida with Janine." He stared at me, his eyes narrowing as he tried to find the fracture line in my resolve. He'd spent 30 years finding the weak spots in negotiators, suppliers, and labor unions. He thought everyone had a price, or a breaking point, or a secret shame they'd do anything to hide. But I didn't want his money, and I didn't care about his approval anymore. The worst thing he could do to me, abandoning me while I watched my mother die, had already happened. "What do you want, Marlo?" he asked bluntly. The corporate mask was fully back on now. The father was gone, only the chief executive remained. "I want Vance out of the executive suite by Friday," I said, my voice cutting through the quiet room like a blade. "He's a liability, and we both know it. He's sloppy, he's arrogant, and he's going to run grandfather's legacy into the ground just to prove he's a big man. He can keep a minority shareholder position, but his operational clearance is revoked." Before my father could answer, the study door clicked open. Vance walked in without knocking, his silk tie slightly crooked, a sheen of sweat glistening on his forehead despite the chilly afternoon air. He didn't even look at me. He went straight to our father. "Dad, the bank is refusing to release the corporate credit lines," Vance stammered, his voice laced with panic. "They're saying there's an administrative hold from the primary trustee. What the hell is going on?" Vance stood by the corner of the desk, his breathing heavy, looking between the two of us like a man who had walked into the wrong theater. When neither of us answered him immediately, his eyes finally fell on the blue folder and the small black USB drive sitting under the desk lamp. "What is that?" Vance asked, his voice dropping its panicked edge and taking on the sharp, defensive tone he always used when he felt excluded. "Dad, why aren't the credit lines clearing?" "Ask your sister," my father said, his voice entirely hollow. He hadn't looked away from me. He was still searching my face, trying to calculate if there was any bluff left to call. Vance sneered, a look I had seen on his face since we were children sharing a backseat on family road trips. "Marlo, what did you do? Did you call the compliance office again? I told you, those internal audits are standard procedure." "It's over, Vance," I interrupted, not looking up at him, but keeping my eyes fixed on my father. "The bank isn't holding the credit lines because of an audit. They're holding them because I filed the updated trustee schedule. Mom made me the sole executor of the underlying asset trust. You don't have the authority to move capital anymore. Neither does Dad." Vance's face went entirely blank for a fraction of a second, before a deep, angry red began to creep up his neck. "That's a lie. Mom signed the succession plan. I was in the room when she did it." "You were in the room when she signed the corporate proxies, Vance. You didn't check the deed schedule," I said, my voice dropping to a quiet, weary rhythm. "You never checked the deed schedule because you didn't think she was smart enough to keep them separate. You thought she was just an old woman who watched television and folded your laundry." "Dad, tell her she's insane." Vance turned to our father, his hands twitching at his sides. "Call Harrison. Call the firm's counsel. We can have this injunction served by tonight. She can't just freeze the operating budget because she's throwing a tantrum about the will. My father didn't move. He reached down, took a slow, deliberate sip of his cold tea, and set the porcelain cup back onto its saucer with a tiny, sharp clink. "Harrison can't fix this, Vance," my father said quietly. It was the first time I had ever heard him admit defeat in front of his son, and the sound of it seemed to take the air out of the room. "What do you mean he can't fix it?" Vance's voice cracked, the boyish terror bleeding through his expensive corporate veneer. "It's our company." "It was grandfather's company," I corrected him, finally turning my head to look my brother in the eye. "And right now, you have until Friday afternoon to clear out your desk at the main office. If your corporate badge isn't on the HR director's desk by 5 o'clock, the internal server logs go to the regional IRS field office." Vance stared at me, his mouth opening slightly as if to speak, but no sound came out. He looked at our father, waiting for the familiar shield of paternal authority to drop down between him and the consequences of his own sloppiness. But our father just sat there, his gaze fixed on the rain-streaked window, his hands folded over his stomach. The silence in the room was absolute, save for the rhythmic, dull clicking of the grandfather clock in the corner. "Dad," Vance's voice was stripped of its bravado now, reduced to the thin, fragile pitch of a teenager who had crashed the family car. "Tell me she's bluffing. She doesn't have internal logs. I deleted those archives myself when we migrated the server over the summer." "You deleted the local backups, Vance," I said, pulling my keys out of my bag. They made a heavy metallic clatter against the blue folder. "You forgot that the primary server uses an automated cloud mirror based out of the warehouse in Ohio, the one grandfather set up in the 90s, and that you never bothered to update because you thought the logistics industry was just about shouting into a Bluetooth earpiece." I stood up, smoothing the front of my dark woolen trousers. For the last 18 months, I had felt so small in this house, moving through the corridors like a ghost, while the two of them discussed the future of the company over expensive steaks in the dining room, treating Mom's illness like an administrative inconvenience. Now, standing over the mahogany desk, the room felt tiny. The heavy leather chairs, the oil paintings of shipping vessels, the silver humidors, it all looked like a stage set for a play that had just ended. "The server logs show every single invoice change you made to mask Janine's art shipments," I continued, looking down at my brother's pale face. "It also shows the $300,000 you transferred into a shell account under your wife's maiden name last October. Mom knew about that too, Vance. She didn't say anything because she was waiting for the notary to finish the trust revisions. She wanted to make sure that, when the hammer fell, it only hit the people who deserved it." Vance took a step back, his hand gripping the edge of the bookshelf to steady himself. His knuckles were white. "You're going to destroy the family name, Marlo. Over what? Resentment? Because Dad gave me the firm instead of you." "The family name was destroyed when Dad let his wife lie in a hospice bed alone while he took his mistress to a resort," I said, my voice dropping so low it was barely a whisper, yet it seemed to echo in the high-ceilinged room. "I'm not destroying anything, Vance. I'm just taking back the keys to grandfather's house." I picked up the blue folder, leaving the black USB drive sitting under the lamp. "I'll be at the main office at 9 o'clock on Monday morning," I said to my father, who still hadn't turned his head to look at me. "I expect your resignation as managing trustee to be on my desk by then. You can keep your honorary title, and you can keep your pension, but you are done making decisions for this family." I walked out of the study without waiting for an answer. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind me, muffling the sudden, explosive sound of Vance finally raising his voice at our father. I stood in the dim, cavernous hallway for a moment, my breath rattling slightly in my throat. The air out here smelled of lemon wax and old wool, the permanent scent of my childhood. I walked down the corridor toward the back of the house, my flats making no sound on the thick Persian runners. I stopped at the door of Mom's bedroom. It had been stripped of the medical equipment yesterday morning by a quiet team of hospice technicians, leaving it strangely hollow. The mattress was bare, the pale blue sheets she loved folded neatly in the linen closet across the hall. I sat on the edge of the mattress, the blue folder balanced on my knees. The house was so quiet now that I could hear the hum of the old grandfather clock all the way from the foyer. For months, this room had been the center of my universe. I had measured my life in milligrams of pain medication, the temperature of lukewarm broth, and the shallow, rhythmic rise and fall of her chest. While my father and brother were downstairs rewriting history, Mom and I had sat up in the dark, talking about things that actually mattered. "They think I'm a ghost already, Marlo," she had whispered to me one night, her hand dry and paper-thin against mine. "They talk about the company assets right outside my door. They think because my body is failing, my mind has already left. But your grandfather didn't raise me to let men take what they didn't build." She had known exactly what she was doing. Every evening, while my father was out networking, she had me bring her old leather-bound journals and the private banking codes her father had given her when she turned 21. She didn't want revenge, she wanted equilibrium. The front door downstairs slammed shut with a force that rattled the glass in Mom's vanity mirror. A few seconds later, the crunch of gravel echoed through the window as Vance's car tore down the driveway, his headlights cutting a brief, frantic path through the rainy dark. He was running to his lawyers or his wife or a bar. It didn't matter. The trap was already sprung. I opened the blue folder again, looking at the very last page beneath her shaky signature. In the margin, written in a faint pencil script that the notary hadn't noticed, were 3 words: "Fix it, Marlo." I closed the folder, pulled my phone from my pocket, and dialed a number I had kept hidden in my contacts for 3 weeks. "Harrison," I said when the firm's senior legal counsel answered. "It's Marlo. My father will be stepping down on Monday. I need you to draft the non-disclosure agreements for the executive board tonight." Harrison didn't answer right away. Through the receiver, I heard the faint clink of ice against glass, then a heavy sigh that sounded more like exhaustion than surprise. He had been the family firm's gatekeeper for nearly 30 years. He knew where every body was buried because he had usually been the one to dig the holes. "Marlo," Harrison said, his voice measured and quiet, "are you entirely sure you want to go down this road? Your father is a proud man. If you corner him like this, he will burn the foundation down just to keep you from owning the walls." "The foundation is already rotten, Harrison," I said, staring at the empty space where my mother's hospital bed had been. "Vance has been using the Ohio accounts to hide Janine's import fees. If the board doesn't see a transition of power by Monday morning, those server logs go to the regional compliance office. You know exactly what that means for the firm's federal shipping licenses." A long silence stretched over the line. I could hear the faint patter of the rain hitting Harrison's office window downtown. He wasn't a cruel man, just a pragmatic one who had spent a lifetime protecting a legacy that my father had slowly turned into a personal piggy bank. "I see," Harrison finally muttered, his tone shifting into the cold, technical register of a corporate counselor. "The board will need to see the trust amendment before they validate the change in executive structure. If the voting rights have truly reverted to you as the sole independent trustee, your father's signature on the resignation isn't even legally required. He's already been bypassed." "The certified copies are on my desk," I replied. "I'll have them couriered to your residence by 8 o'clock tomorrow morning." "Very well," Harrison said softly. "I'll draft the NDA and the transition templates tonight. But Marlo, be careful. Your brother isn't smart, but he's desperate. And desperate men don't care about the rules of engagement." When the call ended, the room felt colder. I stood up from the bare mattress, walked over to the closet, and pulled out a small cardboard box my mother had tucked behind her winter coats. Inside were no corporate papers, no financial statements, and no legal threats. It was just a collection of old photographs, dried flowers from her garden, and a silver-plated baby rattle that had belonged to me. I carried the box down the stairs. The house was entirely silent now. As I passed the study, I saw the door was still cracked open. A single sliver of light cut across the dark hallway floor. I pushed the door open. My father was still sitting at the mahogany desk. He hadn't turned on the overhead lights. The only illumination came from the green-shaded banker's lamp, casting long, skeletal shadows across his face. He looked older than 70. The sharp, terrifying executive who had dictated my entire life looked, for the very first time, like an old man sitting in an empty room. He didn't look up when I stepped into the doorway. "Your mother always thought she was smarter than me," he said, his voice low and raspy. "She thought because she read those thick books and stayed quiet, she was above the business. But she enjoyed the house, Marlo. She enjoyed the lifestyle. She enjoyed the life her father built," I said, leaning against the doorframe. "You were just the man who spent 40 years trying to make her feel guilty for it." My father finally looked up, his eyes bloodshot under the harsh green glare of the desk lamp. "I built this life," he whispered, his voice trembling slightly, not with sadness, but with a cold, boiling fury. "I spent 40 years answering calls at 3 in the morning, dealing with striking dockworkers, and swallowing dirt so you and your mother could sit in this pristine house and judge me. You think you're righteous, Marlo? You're just a parasite who finally found a way to bite the host. If you were a host, Dad, you wouldn't have had to steal from your own logistics lines to fund your mistress's art gallery," I said, my voice remaining entirely flat. "You wouldn't have had to let Vance bleed the Ohio accounts dry just to keep him quiet about Janine. You didn't swallow dirt for us. You did it for your own ego. And when that wasn't enough, you started taking what belonged to Mom." He slammed his hand down on the mahogany desk. The porcelain teacup rattled violently against its saucer, a sharp clack that seemed to crack the heavy silence of the room. "Get out of my sight," he hissed, his fingers curling into a tight fist. "Get out of my house." "It's not your house anymore," I said softly, stepping back into the hallway. "The deed is held by the trust. You have until the end of the month to pack your things. I'll have the movers send everything to the Chicago apartment. I'm sure Janine will help you unpack." I turned away before he could answer, walking down the long hallway toward the front door. Every step I took felt lighter, as if the heavy, suffocating air of my childhood home was finally losing its grip on my lungs. I pulled open the heavy oak front door. Stepping out onto the porch, the rain had slowed to a miserable, freezing drizzle. The headlights of a car suddenly cut through the dark driveway, the engine idling roughly. I expected it to be Vance, returning for another round of screaming, but as the vehicle pulled closer to the porch steps, I recognized the sleek, silver sedan. It was Harrison's personal courier. The driver's side window rolled down, and a young man in a dark raincoat looked up at me, holding out a thick, legal-sized document container. "Miss Vance, Mr. Harrison sent these. He said you'd know what they are. He needs the signed trust copies in exchange." I reached into my canvas tote bag, pulled out the blue folder containing my mother's final, shaky signature, and handed it to the courier. In return, I took the heavy document container. Inside were the freshly drafted non-disclosure agreements, the executive transition templates, and my father's formal involuntary resignation papers. As the courier's car backed down the gravel driveway, its taillights disappearing into the wet mist, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It wasn't a call. It was a text message from an unknown number, but the message itself told me exactly who was on the other end. "You think you've won, Marlo? Check the firm's secondary operating account. Vance didn't just move capital. Look at what he did to the vendor contracts before you froze the system." Freezing rain felt like needles against my face as I stood on the porch, the glow of my phone screen illuminating the text message over and over. I didn't reply. I walked down the steps, unlocked the old Honda my father had so graciously left me, and climbed into the driver's seat. The engine turned over with a rough, metallic shudder, the heater blowing cold, stale air into my face before finally warming up. I pulled up the firm's secure financial portal on my phone, bypassing the main dashboard and digging deep into the secondary operating node. The obscure, subsidiary account Vance used to pay out local freight subcontractors. My stomach dropped into a cold, hollow void. Vance hadn't just tried to move cash. He had systematically terminated our exclusive freight contracts with the Midwest independent owner-operators, men and women who had driven for my grandfather for 30 years, and reassigned those routes to a newly registered entity called Apex Logistics LLC. The effective date of the transfer was midnight tonight. Apex Logistics was registered to a P.O. box in Delaware. The registered agent, Janine's brother. Vance hadn't just been sloppy, he had been a Trojan horse. He and my father were prepared to let me keep the shell of the original company while they bled the actual operational muscle, the drivers, the routes, the client relationships, into a brand new corporate body completely free of my mother's trust. By Monday morning, I would have been presiding over an empty warehouse and a mountain of legal liabilities while they launched a carbon copy of the firm across the street. I put the car in reverse, backing down the gravel driveway with a spray of wet stone. I didn't drive toward my apartment downtown. I drove toward the industrial district, where the gravel roads turn into cracked asphalt and the sky is permanently orange from the sodium lights of the shipping yards. The main warehouse was dark, save for the glass-walled dispatch office on the second floor. A single truck, a battered, dark blue Peterbilt, was idling in the bay, its exhaust piping white plumes into the freezing night air. I climbed the metal fire escape stairs to the dispatch office, my boots echoing sharply in the hollow structure. Inside sat Bram. He was 64, his beard a thick tangle of gray, his flannel shirt stained with coffee and diesel grease. He had been my grandfather's first hired driver in 1974. He looked up from a stack of manifest sheets, his eyes tired and heavy behind thick lenses. "Marlo," Bram said, setting down his pen. He didn't sound surprised to see me at midnight. He just looked sad. "Your brother sent out the automated termination notices 2 hours ago. My boys are already backing their rigs out of the yard. He told us the company was dissolving due to your mother's estate costs." "The company isn't dissolving, Bram," I said, leaning against the vending machine, my breath still coming in short, ragged bursts. "My brother lied to you. He's trying to steal your roots for a shell company." Bram looked at the manifest sheet, his heavy thumb tracing the edge of the paper. "Doesn't much matter what he's trying to do, kiddo. The system says our contracts are void at midnight. If we haul under the old flags tomorrow, we aren't insured. And my guys can't afford to risk their rigs on a family feud." "They won't be hauling under the old flags," I said, pulling the heavy document container Harrison had given me out of my tote bag. "They'll be hauling under the original trust charter, the one my father tried to bury 10 years ago."